Good evening, Jackson. I'm hoping that you won't necessarily need this video to show the video, but you just needed to get my answers. If not, I can make a better quality video. So, your question number one was what first sparked my interest in wanting to discover information about the civil rights movement? Well, for me, I've always been fascinated with history. I am big on that you cannot know where you're going unless you know where you've been. And I think it's very important that as a country, and especially as an African American male in this country, that I should know the history as far as those who went before me, those who fought for certain rights, those who died for certain rights, where we're at in terms of those rights today. Have we made progress? Well, how can you know if you've made progress if you don't know how far you've come from, and how will you know how much further we need to go? And so that's what kind of sparked my interest, and then also having mentors in my life who would always educate me on Black history and the civil rights movement and things of that nature, and they always told me to make sure I knew that so I could pass it on to the next generation. Question number two you asked was, what is my experience teaching civil rights, teaching on the civil rights movement? How do I make teaching about the civil rights movement memorable? Well, like I said, one of my passions is speaking about a lot of things in terms of race, racism, racial reconciliation, things of that nature in America. And that may include teaching on civil rights. So I like to teach people far as who were some of the key players, and we always know about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and individuals like that. But I also like to teach individuals about some of the important people who didn't get the same notoriety, some of the people who were behind the scenes. I like to especially teach young people about the role that young people played in civil rights and how important that role is and how important knowledge about what we've done, what we've been through, and where we're going. And I try to make it memorable by just my enthusiasm, my passion. I like to tell a lot of stories. As you recall from when you heard me speak about Malcolm X, it was very story heavy. I gave illustrations. I try to draw the crowd in. I try to take things that some people may not find to be too exciting, and I try to make it more exciting, make it more memorable, and make it very practical. How did the March on Washington affect the civil rights movement? The March on Washington was very important. You had not only Dr. King but also other speakers. You had the freedom riders who attended. There were a lot of individuals who galvanized, who came together, who pooled their resources, their collective energies, and you had a synergy. You had a power that existed due to the March on Washington based upon the sheer number of individuals who attended, the sheer number of individuals who participated. It was very informative, and of course, what came out of that most people remember most would be Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and which has become one of the most iconic speeches of all time. And that speech reminds us of some of the things that we were hoping to accomplish due to that march. And it wasn't just about having dreams, but also about challenging the country to be accountable in terms of equality when it comes to economics, when it comes to power, when it comes to protection and things of that nature. That was the bulk of what Dr. King was speaking about in that "I Have a Dream" speech. And so the March on Washington was very influential in the civil rights movement. How were Martin Luther King's actions during the civil rights movement different from Malcolm X's actions? As I touched on that evening when I spoke about Malcolm X, they had very similar goals. They both wanted to see equality for black people. Dr. King spoke about it in terms of equality. Malcolm X often spoke about it in terms of um, black empowerment. seen black people treated fairly, but their ways of going about it were, I wouldn't say vastly different, but they were different. Dr. King was more, he adopted Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent philosophy, whereas Malcolm X, he also was big on having peaceful protests and things of that nature, but he was also big on protecting yourself. That's where that any means necessary came from. It wasn't saying you go out and you loot and you riot and you be violent, but don't turn the other cheek when your oppressor tries to attack you. And so that's where they really differed, was their view on how to react to violent attacks. They were both against oppression. They were both against inequality. They were both against segregation. They were both wanting to see black people be treated fairly, but they differed in terms of that nonviolent protest versus if someone turns the dogs on you while you're protesting, by every means, protect yourself, defend yourself at all costs. Question number 5, what were some smaller, lesser-known civil rights acts that had a great impact on the civil rights movement, and how did they affect the civil rights movement? Well, I think perhaps one of the greatest acts that doesn't get the attention that it should, that it deserves, would be, like I said, the role that young people played in the civil rights movements. There's a documentary, I think it's called The Children's March, and it really talked about how young people turned the tide when it came to civil rights. And this kind of ties into question 6. I'm going to combine those two. It says, why were African Americans that participated in the civil rights movement willing to be sent to jail and beat? Why didn't they fight back? Once again, it was that Dr. King's nonviolent approach. He just about mandated that if anyone was to participate in the marches that he had organized, that they had to practice restraint. If you go sit in the lunch counters where you weren't supposed to be to sit, and they throw milkshake at you and they spit in your face, you take it. If we're marching and they turn the water hose on, you take it. If they sick the dog, you take it. That was his approach. When they arrest us, okay, we'll go to prison. And not only did he get that from Mahatma Gandhi, but he also was a big follower and a big practitioner and studier of the Bible. So he knew about the Apostle Paul, who was often beaten and jailed for the gospel, and yet he took it. And oftentimes Dr. King refers to himself in that way. He likens himself to an Apostle Paul type figure. So that was his philosophy. When we're beaten, when we're jailed, we take it because we're going to show that we are better than our oppressors. So tying that back into question number 5, when these adults were getting beaten, when these adults were going to jail, sooner or later that was impacting their economics, because now you get arrested, you got to pay to get out of jail, you get arrested, you're going to be missing days of work. So all of a sudden these adults who had accumulated some wealth, they weren't rich, but they had whatever they had, they began to notice that, hey, we have something to lose. That if we get arrested, we have something to lose. If we get shot and killed, we have something to lose. And all of a sudden, the adults began to become less radical and say, you know what, maybe we shouldn't be marching. Maybe we shouldn't be protesting. We need to play these things safe. But then it was their younger kids who were saying, well, think about it this way. If the world doesn't change, you all are older, you're going to die off soon. We're going to be the generation, and our kids are going to be the generation that inherit this mess. So we want to be a part of this change also. Allow us to protest, allow us to sit in. And a lot of the parents was like, no, this is for grown folks. It's too risky. But a lot of the children took it upon themselves, especially teenagers, to say, you know what? No, this is our country also, and we have a stake in this fight. And they began to protest. And by sheer number, for every 2 parents, there may be 4 or 5 kids. So just based on sheer number, there were more younger people than there were older people, and those sheer number of young people with the passion and the energy, getting arrested and getting beaten and sitting in and doing it all over again, that really turned the tide. So I think that was something that was lesser known, but that was very important. Question 7. In the 1960s, how was the murder of African Americans legal? Well, it was legal because at that time, a lot of people didn't see black people as being human. You can Google and find out what something called the Three-Fifths Compromise when it came to voting and taking census of black people. They were considered three-fifths human, or three-fifths of a person. So one whole person didn't count when in the census. They were considered three-fifths of a person, seen as animals, seen as less than animals. There's documentations about some scientific stuff that was, of course, later debunked, that maybe black people don't even have souls, that they're not human, that they don't have souls like other people do. So when you devalue a person like that, taking their life, it doesn't mean a whole lot. And so black people weren't seen as human; they were often seen as property, and so their lives weren't seen as to be valued. How did people who murdered them not go to jail? Once again, why would it be a crime? So it'd be no different than us killing an insect. You see a fly, you swat the fly. No one takes you in jail because it's just a fly. No one takes you to jail when you kill a mosquito or a spider. In a lot of ways, that's how blacks were seen back then. So it wasn't illegal. In fact, it was something to be celebrated. You can Google and find pictures of black people being hung with crowds of people, and not just murderers and killers, but I'm talking about whole families who would crowd around and eat popcorn and almost like they were at the movie theater watching these hangings, watching black people being burned alive. There are photographs all over that you can find like that. So it was entertainment, it was sport, because blacks weren't seen as human. And so why should you go to jail for killing someone when that person isn't seen as human? And then lastly, how did the government get control of America to stop racism when people were not following the government rules? Well, I personally believe that the government hasn't stopped racism. I'm not sure if racism will ever end, because it's in our nature to always want to see ourselves as superior to others. It's in our nature to always want to oppress, and it's big money also. Slavery was very profitable to the United States. Jim Crow laws were very profitable to the United States. Currently, the prison industrial complex, the mass incarceration of blacks and browns, people all over, is very profitable. That's the easiest way to make money, is to have cheap labor, slave labor, whether it's in prisons, whether it was slavery, whether it was Jim Crow, whether it was sharecropping. And so it's hard to get someone to stop something when money's attached to it, because now you're messing with their money. So even if they were moral enough to say, yeah, let's stop it, economically speaking, it's still tough to say, it's hard to get it up. And so it would be great if racism ended. I wouldn't hold my breath, but I think on an individual level, each person does have a responsibility to try to combat racism, first in their own lives and in the lives of those around them. And I think if we did that one by one, we can begin to turn this thing around, at least to have us going in a positive direction. I hope this has been very helpful. This is a 14-minute video. I hope that's not too long, but the good thing is it's better to have more information than not have enough information, so you can always chop it up as you feel fit. All right, take care. Good night.